This is a video I wanted to do for a while because I get this all the time, and I felt this all the time when I was younger. I love the feeling of a particular guitar's neck, or I hate this guitar's neck and I can't figure out why. When I was young, I had no idea, and nobody I knew had any idea. You'd pick up a guitar in a guitar store and you go, wow, this feels great. Or you go, it doesn't feel so good. How come? Most of the time you think, well, it must be the string height, it must be the action. Lower the action, lower the action. Even now, that's what I get with customers, lower the action. Sometimes that's the problem. More often, it's a combination of the four factors I'm going to talk about now. These are factors when you go shopping for a guitar, you should probably have already decided, but you should certainly check out when you're in the guitar store. Number one is the shape and thickness of the guitar neck. Guitar necks come in almost an infinite variety of shapes and thicknesses. If you go to the Fender website, for example, they actually list the dimensions of a variety of necks that they make and have made over the years. There's at least a dozen. Usually those necks are designated with letters. So someone will say it's a C-shaped neck. So it's similar to the letter C in shape. Or it's a D-shaped neck, a U-shaped neck, a V-shaped neck, which sort of is pointy. This particular neck is called a soft V. It has a slight V shape, but the tip of the V is rounded. So the shape of the neck, the thickness of the neck is very important. But there's no one size fits all. Some people love a very thin, modern C-shaped neck. Some people like a big, thick, old vintage neck that are lovingly now called baseball bats because they're so thick. And everything in between. I happen to love this soft V. So when you play a lot of guitars, feel the neck, feel the playability, the ergonomics, the way it works with your particular hand, whether you have a small hand like I do, kind of small, or a big hand. So that's number one. Factor number two, the width at the nut. Here's our nut. Many guitars have different widths there. The width of the nut will impact the distance between strings. I hear people say it doesn't matter, that it's such a tiny difference. Nonsense. It matters. This particular guitar is 1.650 inches at the nut. Before I had this guitar, most of the guitars I've owned in my adult life have had a 1 11/16 inch width at the nut, which is slightly wider than this. Other guitars, for example, very vintage Fender guitars, have a 1 5/8 width at the nut. Now the difference between 1 11/16 and 1 5/8 is only a 1/16 of an inch, and yet you absolutely can feel the difference. That means if you have a small hand, you might, I emphasize might, want a smaller width at the nut. If you have a big hand, you may want that extra space between the strings. So you want to consider that. If you've played many guitars before, you probably know, depending on your style of play, whether you like a thin width at the nut or something bigger. There are guitars that are 1 3/4 of an inch at the nut. And classical guitars are often 1 7/8 of an inch. When I play a classical guitar, it just feels enormous and unplayable to me because I'm used to a smaller width at the nut. The other thing is, even though it's a 1/16, let's say the difference between this and a 1 11/16 width at the nut is less than a 1/16 of an inch. As the guitar tapers and gets wider, that difference increases. So even though it may seem a tiny difference here, by the time you get to the 12th fret, it's a bigger difference. So you may consider play lots of guitars, find out what you like. If you're a fingerstyle player, you may want a wider width of the nut. If you're a lead player, you may want a narrow width of the nut. And again, it depends on the size of your hands and your comfort. So width at the nut is important. The third factor is the radius of the neck. Now we're not going to be able to really see this on the video, but almost all necks have a curve. They have a radius. The exception is classical guitars, which generally have a flat neck. But everything else has some kind of a radius. You'll see if you go online for guitars that they list a number for the radius. The smaller the number, the bigger the curve. A very vintage Fender had a 7¼ inch radius. You can go find out the formula for how you determine the radius, but it doesn't really matter. The only thing to care about is smaller number, bigger curve. This is a 9½ radius, this particular guitar. That too has plenty of curve. There are guitars that have a 12 radius, a 16 radius, even a 20 radius. At that point, you're getting to the point where you almost have no curve. It's almost flat. Now, what are the advantages? And again, this is about feel. There is no one-size-fits-all here. People will suggest that if you're a rhythm player and you play bar chords and our hands and our fingers are not dead flat. We have a curve to our fingers, so that a radius is a good thing, particularly if you're a rhythm player. On the other hand, a lot of lead players love a flatter fingerboard. They love going way up the neck, and they like the feel of a flatter board. Personally, I like a curve. I like a radius. Again, I have a small hand. It's a curvy hand. It's becoming a pretty old hand, and so I appreciate the radius. So I appreciate the 9½ radius here. This is, again, an important factor, and if you play lots and lots of guitars, you'll get to the point where you know, I like more radius, I like less radius. So play a lot of guitars and see whether you like a neck that has a flatter board or a curvier board, because it is important. Once you get to that point, you know what you like, you're set. You can go around and you can go to the store and say, I want a flat fingerboard, as flat as possible, or I want a really curvy fingerboard like a 9½, or even a super curvy board like a 7¼ The fourth factor, and this one is less customizable, is the scale length of the neck. The scale length of the neck is the distance between the nut and the bridge. This guitar, as are most Fender style guitars, has a scale length of 25½ inches. So a Stratocaster or a Telecaster will have a 25½ inch scale length. Most Gibsons are 24¾ inches. So like a Les Paul would be 24¾ inches. Now, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? For one thing, the longer the scale length, the wider the distance between each fret. And so therefore, a Fender guitar at 25½ inch scale length will have fret distances that are slightly wider than a Gibson guitar at 24¾ inches. So for some people, that smaller scale length will feel more comfortable to make big chords because the frets are slightly more closer together. The other issue about a smaller versus a longer scale length is the longer the scale length, when you tune the strings to pitch, the more tension you're putting on the string. Consequently, it may feel like, it does feel like, it takes more pressure to depress the strings on a longer scale length than a shorter scale length. So some people may feel that on a Gibson it's easier to press down the strings. Now, there's a way around that, which is you get a lighter gauge string. So if you use a tens on a Gibson, you might use a 9.5 on a Fender. In fact, I have 9.5s on this. So now, on the positive note, a lot of people like the sound that you get from a longer scale length. The consequence of all this is when you buy a Stratocaster style guitar, whether it's made by Fender or somebody else, or whether it's a Chinese copy, you're getting a 25.5-inch scale length. If you wanted to say to somebody, give me a Stratocaster, but make it 24 3/4, at that point it's no longer a Stratocaster. It will sound different and it will feel different, and so companies rarely do that. Same thing, if you want a Les Paul, but you want it with a 25.5-inch scale length, it's no longer really a Les Paul. The consequence of all this is you may find that you like a smaller or a longer scale length, but you're kind of stuck. If you like a Fender, you're getting a 25.5-inch scale length in most cases. If you like a Gibson, you're getting a shorter scale length in most cases. So you're sort of stuck with that. Even if you think, I'll have somebody make a custom neck for me, and you can afford to do that, you still fundamentally change the character of the guitar, so most people don't end up doing it. But it is something to keep in mind, because if you have a small hand, you may feel less comfortable with a longer scale length. You may pick up a Fender and say, boy, this is harder to make chords. You may pick up a Gibson and say it's a little easier to reach the chords because it's a shorter scale length. And finally, there's one final factor that has changed a lot over the last 20 years, and that's the fret material itself and the fret size. Most frets, and back in the day, were just sort of an ordinary, average, normal size. Today, medium jumbo frets are very popular. Jumbo means the fret, the actual width of the fret is wider. And some people love jumbo frets. Some people don't love jumbo frets. Some people love the medium jumbo frets. Some people like tall frets, so you can get a fret that's a little bit taller than the standard kind of a fret. This is something that you're best off playing a lot of guitars in the guitar store and seeing whether the fret size, the fret width makes a difference. There's also the difference in material. Traditional frets like this were nickel silver. They wear over the years, and eventually you will need to refile, level the frets. There's also stainless steel frets nowadays. A lot of people love them because they almost last forever. They're such hard material that you don't have to re-level them. So those are the 4 or 5 factors that make up the ergonomics of a neck. And it's very important because no matter how great the guitar sounds, if it feels uncomfortable to play or flat out feels unplayable for you, then it's no good. So I hope this was helpful. By all means, send me any questions you might have. Thanks.